Okay, we've already got quite a lot of people coming in. It's fantastic, wonderful. I know that this has proven to be extremely popular, Anna. So I'm very excited about this.
Good.
Very excited. I've been waiting for a long time. And lots of people are as well, by the looks of it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us as we see how many people come in. Okay, so I think we've probably stabilized a bit now into... Okay, so are you ready, Anna?
I am, I think.
Wonderful. So thank you. Welcome, everybody, to this special online event exploring the Victoria and Albert Museum's exhibition Kimono, Kyoto to Catwalk, which is Europe's first major exhibition dedicated to kimono. In today's event, we are delighted. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time, and I am rather excited, I must say. We're delighted to be joined by the exhibition curator, Anna Jackson, to discuss the development of this exhibition, which reveals the sartorial, aesthetic, and social significance of the kimono from the 1660s to the present day. If you're joining us, please do tell us what you think as well on social media. We have some hashtags, which you can see down there as well. I also have some housekeeping just before we start. Please note that your microphone and webcam will be disabled for the entire duration of the event, and we encourage you to ask questions. We'll have a question and answer session at the end. And please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Any questions will be collected by Japan House moderators, and we'll be able to ask them right at the very end. Please note that the contents of this event will be recorded and may be shared afterwards. I know you've got some really exciting images to show us, Anna, so I don't want people to miss that as well. On the left-hand side, you should have, if you're viewing, a large part of your screen devoted to the slides, and then you should have two smaller videos of one of Anna and one of me. So thank you very much indeed, once again. We're very, very happy and privileged to have you join us at Japan House. Just to let everybody know, Anna, you are the keeper of the Asian department at the Victoria and Albert Museum. You're the curator of this exhibition, Kimono, Kyoto to Catwalk, and the editor of the accompanying book. You've written widely on all sorts of things to do with Japanese textiles. You're a specialist in cross-cultural exchange, and you've got some really interesting topics to come up with us. I just thought, I found this upstairs. I know, of course, the exhibition had to... Yes, just before breakdown. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about that later on. Over to you, Anna. Can I leave you to
share the screen successfully? Okay.
Wonderful. So this is the exhibition, isn't it? Yep. What inspired you to curate this exhibition?
Well, obviously, I've been looking after kimono at the V&A for quite a long time, so it's probably been bubbling around in my head for many years. But I think the V&A, as many of you probably know, is a really justly famous for its fashion exhibitions, but inevitably, perhaps, those have always focused on Western fashion. And I think there is just generally a perception that fashion is a European invention. So really, we wanted to show that fashion flourishes elsewhere in the world, in Japan itself. But I suppose if you say to people kimono, they don't necessarily think of that as an item of fashion. We have this idea about it being a sort of iconic symbol of Japanese culture, traditional, sort of timeless, unchanging costume. So really in the exhibition, our aim was to counter that and to show that kimono have always been highly fashionable, dynamic items of dress. And we also show that fashion has really crossed cultural and geographic boundaries. The kimono has crossed geographic boundaries, and although we see it as uniquely Japanese, it's had a real impact on global styles of dress really since the 1660s. So as you go into the exhibition, the first sort of case you see kind of highlights the sort of chronology of, that we cover in the show, and also the sort of different themes. So we have this wonderful kimono from about 1800 that we borrowed from Japan, which really kind of shows how amazing the designs are that you often get on historic kimono, the beautiful techniques that he used to create these designs. In the middle, we have a work by Don Galliano, who's probably perhaps one of the European designers who's supposed to be most influenced by East Asian dress throughout his career. This is from his seminal collection for Christian Dior from 2007, which combines a sort of Dior bar jacket with a sort of the long cylindrical line of the kimono in the sort of skirt with the sort of crossover and the heavy hem. And then the one on the right is by Jotaro Saito. It's been made specially for the exhibition. And he's a kimono maker who's based in Kyoto, but he has a shop in Tokyo, and he shows on the catwalks at Tokyo Fashion Week. And he sees himself very much as a fashion designer rather than just a kimono designer.
Okay. So I was quite interested to see that the exhibition started with shopping.
Yeah, I think in many discussions about art and design, people forget commerce. You know, perhaps it's a bit of a dirty word. People don't want to mention it. But it's a vital part of the story. It's often, of course, demand that leads to change in styles and art and design. And it's certainly very important when we look at the emergence of a fashion culture in Japan in the Edo period. So the period from the early 17th to the mid 19th century. So that constitutes the first section of our exhibition. And after what had been, you know, centuries of civil war and unrest, Japan had been unified at the beginning of the 17th century by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who took the title of shogun, a sort of military ruler, in 1603, fought his last great battle in 1615. And he moved the capital. His capital was in Edo, which was just a small fishing port in the northeast of Japan at the time, a bit of a backwater. But the Edo period really was a period of enormous peace and prosperity, rapid urbanization, and the increased demand for luxury goods, including kimono. So Kyoto remained the sort of heartland of the luxury kimono production. That's where kimono were always made. And it's certainly the place where the first sort of shift into sort of a fashion culture with a new sort of spirit of sophistication arose in the 1660s. But the emphasis soon shifted to Edo, to the new capital, which by 1800 was the biggest city in the world. And of course, it's still one of the biggest cities. We call it Tokyo today. And here, so in the 19th century, we've got these three beautiful women here enjoying the pleasures of shopping. They're outside the Daimaruya Kimono store, which was established in 1728. And I hope you can see at the back of the slide, inside the shop, you can see all these, the attendants carrying great bales of cloth to show the customers. But if you were particularly rich, you didn't have to go to the shop would come to you. And that's what you see here on the left hand of the screen. I mean, you could just go to the shop and buy a length of fabric and make it up into a kimono at home. And that was the sort of the everyday garments that people wore, which don't often survive. So what does survive is the haute couture of the day, if you like. Rich clients were commissioning these, and these were always special commissions. And the kimono merchant would orchestrate all the skills of the weavers and the dyers and the embroiderers and bring all these skills together to create the kimono. So what you see here on the left is a sales clerk from the Echigoya, which is probably one of the most famous of the kimono stores, which was established in 1673 by a man called Mitsui Takatoshi. He's often known as the father of marketing in Japan because he was, you know, he put his crest, his logo on umbrellas. So if you went to the store, it started to rain, you'd get an umbrella with his logo on and so on. But here's the sales clerk is showing these two women some cloth and some fabric and a printed pattern. So to give them an idea of what the kimono might look like when it's made. And these printed patterns were really important. The first one was produced in 1660, and that's often where people sort of chart the shift from just changing styles into what we would think of as a fashion culture. And these were woodblock printed books, like of the kind that you can see on the right, possibly about 100 patterns in each book. You could go and go to a bookstore and buy one of these, or you could go and borrow one from one of the kimono stores, and you could just flick through and see what kind of patterns you wanted. Even if you couldn't afford a kimono like this, you might just enjoy reading it, just like we would enjoy reading Vogue or something, to see the latest patterns. And these were produced, you know, each version of the book would be produced in its hundreds, if not thousands. So although we do have the books and we do have the kimono that survive, it's sometimes quite hard to sort of pair them up, if you like. So we are very excited to find that a book in our collection at the V&A contained a pattern, which I hope you can see on the far right, that actually matches a kimono that exists in a collection in Japan. So it's very nice to be able to display those at the same time.
Oh, goodness. So what are the main characteristics of kimono? What distinguishes them?
Well, the interesting thing about kimonos, they're universal garments. By the beginning of the Edo period, everybody wore a kimono, regardless of their gender or their social status. Everybody wore them. And kimono just means the thing to wear. It's actually quite a relatively new umbrella term, probably used more since the 19th century. Before that, these kind of garments would tend to be known as kosode, which means small sleeve, which refers to where your wrist comes out. You can just see the sort of red on either side of this kimono, which is where your arms come out of the sleeves. I suppose the main characteristic of kimono is that they are completely straight seamed garments made from one bolt of cloth with minimal cutting, and they just sort of drape on the shoulders and they wrap around the body, left over right, tied around the middle with a sash called an obi. And this sort of conception of clothing, creation of clothing, is very difficult in terms of if we compare it with the West. In the West, we look at sort of cuts and construction. It's all about the fit to the body. We emphasize the body shape, or perhaps suppress some of the body shape. We emphasize the waist or the bust or whatever. In Japanese clothing, in kimono, the body is almost irrelevant. There's sort of no connection between the body. And it was really the surface of the kimono that was very, very important. It was on the surface that the wearer expressed their gender, social status, wealth, taste, and so on. So we know that this garment is an outer kimono. It would be worn on top of other kimono in the winter months, a bit like an open coat, and has this big, thick, heavy red hem to sort of make it hang nicely. And we know from the long sleeves that it'd be worn by a young unmarried woman. And we know from the kind of pattern on it that it would be worn on formal occasions by a young woman of the samurai class. When you say samurai, you tend to think of samurai warriors in armor, but this was the military ruling aristocracy of Japan. And we've got this wonderful combination here, beautifully woven silk. You can't really see there's a pattern in the silk. You can't really see very clearly from the screen, unfortunately. And there's the patterns are painted directly on the cloth or created through stenciling, and then there's embroidery. So this is a wonderful combination of techniques. So really the sort of T-shaped kimono with this great broad expanse of cloth became the canvas for truly remarkable designs in the Edo period.
So you see it as a work of art then as well, do you?
Well, it's certainly a work. These are certainly works of enormous artistry. Mm-hmm. But I think there's probably slightly of a problem seeing them as works of art. And that's partly because this is how we display them. If you go into the V&A, normally any museum in the world, in fact, they would show a kimono on a tea stand. So it would look much as you're seeing it in the picture here, because that's the best way that you can see the beautiful patterns. And also these historic garments are intrinsically fragile. So if you start putting them on mannequins and wrapping them and tying an obi around them, you could damage them. And historic obi and undergarments and so on don't survive either. So they're always shown like this. So we rather set ourselves the challenge in the exhibition because we really wanted people to see that they're not two-dimensional works of art, they're clothes. So we set ourselves a challenge where we could to put historic garments on mannequins, on bodies. So this is what this one looks like when it's on display. Because it's an outer kimono, we didn't have to worry about tying it with an obi with a sash, but it would have been worn over other kimono, which would have had an obi at the back. So our conservators have made these wonderful props for underneath to make sure the garment's safe, and they've made a little cushion at the back to replicate what the obi would have looked like. So it really gives a sense of a person wearing it with this volume, and it really changes the way you look at garments, I think. And we also had great fun with wigs and things, as you can see. And beside it as well is a man's kimono we also put on a mannequin, although that's not a real obi because we didn't want to damage the garment. It's just a sort of fake one, if you like. So the ruling samurai class were really important consumers of luxury kimono, but it was actually it was the merchant classes who proved the real catalyst for the developments in these sort of textile artistry and this increased demand for luxury kimono. And the merchant classes, there was quite a strict hierarchy in Japan in the Edo period, samurai at the top, then the farmers, then the artisans and merchants at the bottom. They were seen really as a sort of necessary evil, but they were the ones that benefited most from the peace and prosperity. They were the ones, because there was a great demand for goods. They couldn't use their money for social advancement, so they spent quite a lot of it on sort of elegant pastimes and luxury pursuits and buying clothes. And it was often very conspicuous consumption, as you can see from that quote there. And it was really the merchant classes were the ones who really demanded the latest kind of styles. But this kimono here dates from the late 17th century, and there are no kimono of this age in European collections. So this is another one we've borrowed from Japan, and we've worked very closely with our colleagues in Japan in sort of choosing some of the wonderful things that they've lent to us.
Yes, indeed. Here you have a woodblock print. I noticed that in the exhibition, alongside the kimono themselves, you do have a number of Japanese woodblock prints. Why are these important to the story of kimono?
Yeah. Well, I think for our audiences coming in, we've tried to pair prints with garments, and they really help us understand again how these pieces were worn, what the kimono looked like when they were worn. This one here, for example, shows a woman. It's very early morning, her candle's still burning. She's just got out of bed. That's all her bedding piled up behind her there. She's washing her face. There's a bowl of water, I hope you can see there. She's sitting in front of a mirror. And then one of her attendants is choosing a kimono for her mistress to wear from a rack where the kimono has been airing. And the other attendant is showing her two pieces of fabric, two rolls of fabric that have turned up from Daimaru. You can just see the Daimaru crest on the sort of lower right. And this is really an example of what we would think of today as product placement. But in the Edo period, these things were incredibly important because it's how people learned about fashion. It's how they provided inspiration for fashion as well. They were produced again in their hundreds of thousands, and they were cheap. You know, a single sheet print cost much the same as 2 helpings of noodles, apparently. So very cheap, ephemeral things. So they were consumed in much the same way as we consume fashion images today, as a sort of inspiration, for an aspiration, if you like.
So in your earlier slide, you're talking about fashion. In your earlier slide, I saw a men's kimono, and were men fashion conscious in?
Yes, that was another one of our challenges we faced for the exhibition, is finding the men, because most male dress is quite subdued. Sort of quite strict clothing conventions were applied to men's dress in particular. Tend to be small scale patterns, darker colours. Sometimes the best place to find men is in shunga, in erotic prints, because quite a lot of the prints were very much about beautiful women. The literature at the time emphasised beautiful women. So if you want to find some men, you can find some in shunga. This is a fairly tame erotic print that you see in the middle here, 2 lovers under a cherry tree. And you can see he's wearing, the man at the back, he's wearing stripy hakama. These are the big pleated trousers that men wore over kimono, and a sort of small scale stencil design on his main garment. But he's got a bit of red there. He's got a bit of the flamboyance in his tobacco pouch. And it was through things like in-row, the segmented boxes and tobacco pouches, that men sort of expressed their fashion. The other man, the fashionable youth, wakashu as they're known, that just means adolescent male, but the wakashu did not sort of have the social responsibility of adult men, but they were often sexually active. They would often, with men who were older than them, or with women, perhaps of their own age or older. And their kimono was quite similar, often to women's. This man here, he's got long sleeve kimono, just like a young woman of his own age, sort of teenage age, would wear. But we know it's a man from his stripy hakama, from his swords, and also from the fact you can see his shaved head here. And then later on in life, at the end of his teenage years, he would have his forelock shaved off. And wakashu had actually performed in the very popular Kabuki theatre to begin with, but they were banned in 1660, and women had also been banned even earlier. So, but the Kabuki theatre still remained quite a subversive, seductive space, part of what we think of as the floating world, ukiyo. These kind of prints are known as ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world. And this was a world of sort of glamour and entertainment and eroticism, in which fashionable dress played a very important part. And actors were the real heartthrobs of the day. The clothes they wore, both on and off stage, were eagerly emulated. On the right, you've got the actor Ichikawa Danjiro VII, who was from a very famous lineage of actors. And he wore this costume, you can see him in here, which has a design of a sickle on it, kama, a circle meaning wa, and the character for nu. So together they spell kamawanu, which effectively means I don't give a damn. So, all his fans would rush out, and even just to get something dyed in this clever, witty design, perhaps even just a handkerchief or whatever. All kabuki actors are men, indeed, they still are. And many of them specialize in women's roles. They're known as onagata. And they were seen as the epitome of feminine style quite often. Their clothing was imitated by fashionable women. Bando Shuka, the print on the left, he's an onagata actor, but here he's playing a notorious female thief, and he's wearing this incredible kimono with a skeleton on. And when we were doing research in Japan in a private collection, we found this garment you can see in the middle here. In fact, we found the garment first before we found the print. And it seemed rather unusual to have a kimono with skeletons on. But having found the print, it's possible it was inspired by this quite famous, apparently, kabuki actor's costume. We can't be sure of that, of course, but it certainly has that sort of outlandishness that you associate with kabuki. But we don't know here is whether the kimono in the middle was worn by a man or a woman. But this kimono here was certainly worn by a man. Along the shoulders, I hope you can see there's pairs of characters, Japanese words. There are 3 pairs on the back, 2 on the front. And calligraphy is often incorporated into kimono design, usually just a poem or something, but this is very different. This just reads red hawk, purple hawk, yellow hawk, dancing hawk, young hawk. So it just seems to emphasize the design on the bottom part of the garment, which shows hawks flying around. But in the Edo period, hawk had the connotation of night hawk, which means prostitute, and with a little bit of change of syllable groupings and phonetic emphasis, the characters on the kimono read very differently. They actually read as a conversation between 2 men about visiting a prostitute. So in their sort of, in this kind of teasing playfulness, this kimono really epitomizes the style and wit of merchant classes in the 18th century. And presumably the man who wore this was a denizen of the pleasure quarters, the most famous of which was the Yoshiwara in Edo, the licensed brothel district. And its greatest spectacle was the procession of high-ranking courtesans in their extravagant attire.
The oiran, these, yes. So were they fashion icons as well? These high class.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the floating world was generally, and courtesans again were this idea that they would wear the latest kimono fashions, and they were figures to emulate. People would buy prints of them, so women would be very much inspired by what they wore. The outer kimono on the right, you can see here, is a very, very sort of rather heavy, overly extravagant one, but it's another one of the ones that we have managed to put on a mannequin, and this is how it looks in the exhibition itself. Again, our conservators have made these wonderful undergarments. They're not supposed to be facsimiles of real kimono. They're just plain, the same color as the mannequin, in fact, but just to show what it would have looked like as a whole ensemble. And you can see courtesans on the whole tie their obi on at the front, because obviously they need to get undressed quite quickly. So actually, sorry, I was going to say, so when we're thinking about the floating world, fashion in Japan at this time, it's very, it's about merchant classes who have cash to splash. It's about how kimono makers, kimono retailers, and print publishers work together to exploit those commercial opportunities, and it's all fed by celebrity culture. So in many ways, it's very similar to fashion as we think of it today.
Oh, I see. So during Edo period, when in fact Japan was effectively under sakoku, this idea of closed to the outside world, except for very limited trade really with the Dutch East India Company, wasn't it? But also, I mean, there was trade with China and Korea, but through slightly porous borders. But despite this, how did this cultural interaction, albeit very limited, affect the way that Japanese dressed?
Yeah, well, the Dutch brought exotic goods from other parts of Asia, particularly cloth. They brought it first as almost like diplomatic gifts for the shogun and sort of high-ranking lords, but then they realized there was a real trade to be had. This foreign fabric is known as sarasa in Japan, and brightly patterned Indian cottons of the kind that in this country we call chintz were incredibly popular. very highly prized, very expensive. So on the whole, they were cut up into small pieces and used as tobacco pouches and things like that. But occasionally you do find surviving kimono made out of this fabric. Often it's actually, interesting enough, we were talking about men a minute ago, these are men's undergarments. So beneath that sort of rather restrained exterior, there was often this sort of flamboyant interior to men's clothing styles, and that's what you see in the kimono in the middle there. And on the right, you've got a courtesan again, the epitome of style. Writing to her lover, she looks very distressed. She's gone through a few drafts there, and she's surrounded by great swathes of her sleeping garment. And again, it's got this kind of chintz pattern, though it's more likely to be in the sort of thing that was made in Japan in emulation of Indian chintz, known as wasarasa, Japanese sarasa. What we have on the left is something very different. This is much more unusual. This is a kimono made out of French brocade, woven in Lyon in the 1760s. That's just a little close up there so you can see the pattern. This is made in Europe to be used in European male suits. A bale of it made its way to Amsterdam, made its way to Japan, where it became an outer kimono for a high-ranking samurai woman. And as far as we know, it's unique. I know of no other kimono from this period that's made out of European silk as opposed to cotton. And these objects are displayed in the second section of the exhibition, which deals with the fashionable exchange you were mentioning. And we sort of show both sides of the story. There's a sort of rather fish eye kind of look at the display. But you can see on the left, we've mounted the kimono out of French brocade on a mannequin, just to give a sense of what it might look like. Of course, we don't really know what it looked like of an old samurai woman, but we do have evidence of the reverse side of the story. 100 years before that cloth reached Japan, Anna Elizabeth van Reed, who was the mistress of Slot Zullen Castle near Utrecht, had her portrait painted. And this life-size portrait was really there to show her status and her style. And as you can see, she's chosen to wear a kimono-like garment. And an inventory from the castle from 15 years later reveals that they had 3 such garments in the household. They're known in the Netherlands as Japonse rok, Japanese robes. So as well as bringing cloth to Japan, the Dutch took kimono back to Europe, where the garments caused an immediate stir. Now, of course, there was a tradition in Europe of wearing long, loose robes. Men would often wear them to show that if they were a man of letters, sitting in a library, studying or whatever, they'd wear something usually just grey or brown, lined with fur perhaps, but not exactly what we would call fashion. And suddenly these Japanese robes arrived, silk, beautiful, colourful, and they had an immediate impact. So the Dutch started to commission particular kinds of garments from the Japanese. So they had more tubular sleeves. They didn't have the long sleeves, and they were very heavily padded to make them beautifully warm to wear. And this padding is silk padding rather than, say, fur, which was used in Europe. So they're quite lightweight, but still very, very warm, very luxurious, and they suggest this sort of exotic country from which they've come. Only a few of these original Japanese ones survive, and as you imagine, most of them are in the Netherlands. But the one you can see, the blue one you can see, is just a recent discovery that's been made in the National Trust for Scotland house, New Hales House, just outside Edinburgh. As far as we know, it's the only one in Britain, but who knows? Perhaps there are more to be discovered. In Britain, these garments are known as nightgowns. They're not for wearing in bed. They're wearing for sort of informally around the house. Perfectly acceptable to receive your guests while wearing one, and of course to have your portrait painted. In fact, it showed that you were wealthy and sort of cosmopolitan. And I suppose in some ways they're the sort of forerunners of what we think of today as the dressing gown. Because they were quite simple to make, and there was already a sort of existing tradition of wearing robes, tailors in Europe started to make these garments out of other kinds of fabric. And this one here that we have in the V&A was actually made out of Spitalfields silk, so silk that was woven in London. And you can see that even the designs of the silk have somehow got bigger, the patterning's got bigger to suit these wonderfully large robes. And we also have in the V&A these wonderful pair of dolls who are known as Lord and Lady Clapham. And they're about this big, and they date from the 1690s. And what's amazing about them is that they have every single item of clothing right down to all their underwear. And normally they sit in the British galleries. In the image at the top there, they sit in their formal going out clothing. But of course, because they've got every part of a fashionable wardrobe, they also have their own little kimono style nightgowns. And obviously that's the way they're dressed in our exhibition.
Oh. So that's talking about one influence. How at that time during the Edo period to Europe, during the 19th century, of course, when the Edo period ended and the Meiji period began, Japan opened its doors to the outside world. What happened then? How did this affect kimono design?
It affected men's wearing of kimono because quite a lot of men of the new order started to wear Western style suits. Japan wanted to project this image of being modernized, of being able to take its place on the world stage. And some women of the elite also started to wear Western clothing, which is what you see on the print on the right here. But on the whole, most women carried on wearing kimono, and there was a bit of a backlash against sort of Westernization in the 1880s and 1890s, and kimono wearing became fashionable again. The patterning on the kimono was often very small and very, very subtle, which is what you see here on this garment. And what's interesting is that kimono are always worn in layers. And prior to this, you would choose which different layers. That was part of the sort of fun of dressing up, if you like. You'd choose different kimono layers that would be seen at the neckline or at the hem. Now the kimono tended to come in sort of matching, a pair of matching kimono. So again, this is another one we've put on a mannequin to try and show the different layers, to show what they would be like when they were being worn. And this is my colleague Elizabeth Ann Holdeen, who's my colleague in the textile conservation section. So we've relied a lot on our textile conservators to help us really with the wonderful mounting of these garments. The Japanese manufacturers were very quick to realize that there were new markets to be had, creating garments for Western customers, first of all to Westerners who came to Japan in increasing numbers, and then directly for export. And the Japanese silk merchant, Shino Shobe, established arguably the world's first global fashion brand in 1859 when he opened a shop in Yokohama, the year the treaty port was established. He changed his name slightly, and the spelling of his name, because he thought it would be easier for Westerners. And he would export to shops such as Liberty's. So this gown you can see here on the left, it's a Western style garment in every way, but it was made in Japan out of Japanese silk with Japanese style embroidery and Japanese braiding. On the other side, the one you can see, the day dress, was actually made in London. So this is a kimono that came to London and was very cleverly sort of cut up and reconstructed by two sisters, the Mrs. Turners, who operated in Sloane Street. So whoever wore this dress, it would have a very sort of familiar structure to it, if you like, but a very exciting foreign appearance. And wearing kimono itself is quite popular in the West. On the left is the famous actress Ellen Terry. She's not wearing a kimono as a theatrical costume. She's wearing it really to show that she's avant-garde, she's bohemian, she's artistic, and so on. And with the end of the samurai rule, as you mentioned, the establishment of the Meiji Emperor, a lot of kimono merchants in Japan found themselves with a lot of unsold stock that they'd made for samurai families who no longer needed these very formal garments of the type we saw earlier on the mannequin. And so they sold them to eager foreigners. So quite a lot of the kimono that you see coming to Europe and to America in this period are samurai garments. And at the moment in the middle, that's such a garment, and it made its way into the wardrobe of a woman called Elizabeth Smith, whose husband was a very famous publisher. And you can see she's chosen to wear it for her portrait there. And as far as we're aware, this is the only known survivor where the kimono in a portrait survives as well. So it's very exciting to have it on display in the exhibition.
This is, for me especially, an exciting part of your exhibition and something that I admire in your expertise immensely. Is this an example of cultural imperialism?
Well, I mean, these garments were certainly worn to evoke something of this novelty and this supposed exoticism of this newly discovered country, the newly revealed country. And Japan was certainly viewed as a sort of ideal ancient society. People in Europe often saw it as being sort of the epitome of the Middle Ages. The Japanese were seen to be innately artistic and lived in harmony with nature, and while respecting the rules of of social deference. But all these traits could be admired, of course, but not without a firm conviction that the West was superior. So in some ways, yes, you could say it is an example of cultural imperialism, but it's never quite as straightforward as that, because, of course, for women, choosing these kind of garments was really quite an expression of their individualism and kind of showing that women could lead taste. It wasn't just men who were patrons and who led taste. And it's also important to remember that kimono offered the possibility of garments without corsets. And kimono were very much taken up by the dress reform movement in Britain as a sort of possible alternative to the kind of clothes that were wear. And it's also important to remember that while the East-West balance of power was certainly incredibly uneven, Japan, as we've seen, is not a passive player. We saw that with Shino Shobei. They had this was a relationship and this was a dialogue. And certainly the Japanese recognized that there was this enormous vogue for wearing kimono in the West. So they started to make what was specifically known as kimono for foreigners. And these are two examples that you can see here. And unlike the kind of garments that would have been made for a domestic market, these are always with shiny satin silk, very bold embroidery with flowers, and certainly in the early 20th century, wisteria seemed to be a very, very popular motif. The one in the middle here is constructed in the same way as a domestic kimono, but the blue one on the left is quite interesting because it also has this sash. We don't know if the middle one ever had a sash, but because kimono normally worn with obi, Japanese people realized that people would understand obi in the West, so they created sashes in the same fabric as the garment. But what's most interesting about this one is that it has a triangular panel set into the middle of the back, which means that you can wear this garment over petticoats and it drapes more like a skirt. And as well as this, kimono started to have a really radical impact on European fashions in the early 20th century, as indeed these sort of highly structured, tightly corseted designs were abandoned in favor of straight seams and fabric that draped from the shoulders. And certainly Paul Poiret is seen as the pioneer of these kind of garments. And this mantle, which would have been worn over another gown, is just effectively two bits of rectangular fabric over the body. It's extraordinary, sort of very modern looking kind of design. And this mantle was owned by an American, very famous American socialite known as Emily Grigsby. Was it Emily Grigsby? And she, in fact, also owned the kimono in the middle there. So we know that this very fashionable woman who had all this cutting edge design in her wardrobe also had export kimono. And certainly we look at the fashions of the early 20th century. In the middle there, you've got futuni, a kimono-style coat, which was actually the fabrics inspired by an actual known bit of Japanese fabric. Lanvin on the right, on the left, has got this sort of wonderful big sleeves, kimono-like sleeves. And in fact, it's apart from having sloping shoulders rather than square ones, it's constructed in exactly the same way as a kimono. And even the archetypal straight-seamed flapper dress from the 1920s has taken a lot of inspiration from Japan and Chinese dress. And this one here has a sort of obi-like feature on the back.
So given that they're so kimono-inspired, did women in Japan wear these? Were kimono continued to be worn? How did it work?
I mean, some women certainly did take up Western dress in the 1920s and 30s, perhaps because there was more of an affinity to the style of clothing. But again, most women continued to wear kimono, and the kimono of the period there's sort of this kimono that you can see on the left really sort of epitomizes the incredibly sort of bold designs that you see coming through at the beginning of the 20th century in Japan. No longer that discrete kind of pattern along the hem, suddenly big designs that are almost breaking out of the surface of the cloth are created with chemical dyes, which gave sort of dyers and designers a whole new sort of palette to work with. And this painting is one of my favorites in the exhibition for the 1930s, shows sort of this kimono-clad woman descending the staircase, the epitome of modern fascination. Her lipstick matches her fingernails. She's got a clutch bag under her arm and this fox fur around her shoulders. And so by wearing a kimono, a modern fashionable woman could show that she hadn't totally abandoned Japanese values, but by embracing the latest designs, hairstyles and accessories and so on, she could show that she wasn't a reactionary either. And as in the Edo period, celebrities, famous actresses, would promote particular kind of kimono, particular kind of fabric is what's being promoted here, kind of fabric known as mason, which was a much more sort of hard wearing and durable and cheaper kind of silk that still had the luster of normal silk production. It's a bit like taffeta. It feels a bit like taffeta in the West. And this again was patterned with chemical dyes, making a very sort of bold statement for a sort of fashionable woman. And what you often see is that quite common historic motifs like flowing water, that's what she's wearing here. And what you see in the middle, suddenly that motif is completely sort of enlarged and abstracted, so it looks very modern. And some kimono also have, you know, things that really reflect sort of modern life. So the kimono on the right is about, you know, city life, the bright lights of the city at night with a skyscraper on it. So quite sort of unusual kind of designs. And these kind of styles were promoted by modern department stores. So the old kimono stores like Echigoya became Mitsukoshi. Daimono still kept its name, but they all sort of transformed into modern department stores in the early 20th century. And these kimono could be bought off the peg. They're not mass produced as we would think of it, but they're batch produced. So before, you could either buy the fabric, sew it yourself, or commission a beautifully patterned kimono. So suddenly, for the first time, women could go to a shop and buy a beautifully patterned, exciting, glamorous looking kimono off the peg. So in this section of the show, we really wanted to sort of show this abundance, if you like, and how colourful they all were. So our wonderful designers, Story Studio, created this amazing octagonal mirrored room, which is one of the sort of highlights of the exhibition. People are always very amazed when they step into this incredible space. This rather amazing period of cross-cultural interaction, influences, exciting kimono fashions really came to an end in the mid-20th century with the Pacific War.
And often, of course, when we're talking about Japan in the 20th century, the Second World War is something that one says before the war and after the war.
Yeah.
How did this affect kimono wearing?
Well, as people, women sort of rebuilt their lives and their homes and their wardrobes after the Pacific War, many of them turned to sort of Western style dress. And what you see particularly from the 50s onwards, is this real dramatic decline in the actual wearing of kimono. And the status and meaning of the garment really shifted from the practical to the symbolic. Mm-hmm. It ceased to be an item of everyday dress, an item of fashion. It became instead a codified ceremonial costume that would be donned for special occasions such as graduation or weddings, or worn for particular cultural activities like the tea ceremony or ikebana. And the kimono really became treasured and revered almost as the essence of Japaneseness in an increasingly globalized world. And that's the image that we have now of the kimono: unchanging, traditional, somewhat restricting, perhaps difficult to wear. And this is certainly what it was for Yukiko Yoshi. You see her here at her coming of age ceremony in 1991. So when people turn 20, that's the coming of age in Japan. And she never wore kimono. She didn't like kimono. She wasn't interested in kimono. And she wanted her family to buy her a car to celebrate her coming of age. But instead, they splashed out probably the same amount of money on this incredible ensemble, which she wore only once. But of course, I suppose the car might have become scrap by now, but the ensemble survives for us. Another thing that happened after the war, of course, was the American occupation of Japan. Another reason why everything became quite westernized quite quickly. And there was a real fear, I think, that historic buildings, craft practices, and so on were going to die out in Japan. So in the 1950s, the government passed a series of laws sort of protecting tangible and intangible cultural assets. So that the intangible ones included things like weaving and dyeing skills. And they give the most skilled practitioners of those particular skills the title sort of designated as intangible cultural properties, more popularly known as living national treasures. And this is what Moriguchi Kunihiko is. He's a living national treasure. But as you can see, his kimono are though he uses the Yuzen technique, a historic technique that originated in the 17th century, he creates these incredibly sort of abstract, very sort of modern, universal kind of designs. And it's not just government, many individuals and small businesses are striving to preserve these kind of skills. So what you see on the right is a kimono, again, made especially for the exhibition by Futaba En. They're a small workshop in Tokyo, and they do stencil dyeing and very much of what's known the wasarasa, the sort of Japanese sarasa style that first inspired by the Dutch. And then in the middle, you see something that's the product of a very recent project to revive the manufacture of mason, the kind of kimono that we saw in the mirrored room. And this mason was made primarily in Isazaki near Tokyo. And a group of people there have got together to sort of revive the kind of techniques and create a new kimono. And this one's designed by Sudo Reiko, who's a very famous textile designer in Japan.
Wonderful that you have two people that I admire greatly in kimono creation here on the left, Moriguchi-san, and then of course Sudo-san on the right there, coincidentally together. We're talking to Sudo-san, just a little hint for the future, yes, at Japan House. So these images of the kimono we see here, I mean, especially the one on the left, is quite striking. But a lot of what we see, of course, is through film, isn't it? Japanese film gives us a lot of images of kimono.
And certainly, if you think of Akira Kurosawa, the great Japanese director, that's, he presents a world where everyone can wear kimono every day. And the V&A, this was another discovery we made in our theatre and performance collections, that the V&A actually has an ensemble that was worn by the legendary Toshiro Mifune in the title role of Sanjiro. And these films and the costumes did really much to shape the prevalent image of the samurai as a swashbuckling yet modest warrior. But of course, Hollywood's given us a slightly different version of Japan, rather romantic, stereotypical image in Memoirs of a Geisha, adapted from Arthur Golden's best-selling book. And fabulous costumes, they're very central to the story, central to the film, and they won the designer, Colleen Atwood, an Oscar. But the kimono is a rather remarkable garment. While it's often viewed as traditional, as we said, specifically Japanese, its seemingly timeless quality means it can be simultaneously universal and even futuristic. And nowhere is this universal quality more powerfully and evocatively realized than in that famous galaxy far, far away. The Star Wars character, Obi-Wan Kenobi, was sort of part Zen Buddhist monk, part samurai, brave samurai, and George Lucas has certainly acknowledged his debt to Kurosawa and apparently originally thought of offering the part of Obi-Wan to Mifune. I believe Mifune turned it down because he felt his English wasn't good enough. But certainly the garments are very consciously modelled on kimono, and in fact all the actors referred to them, all the Jedi referred to their garments as kimono. Interestingly, performers often wear kimono as well. The kimono, again, sort of this notion of them being quite exotic, but again, they have a sort of ambiguity that allows for multiple meanings, giving artists perhaps a way of experimenting with notions of cultural sexual identity. So Freddie Mercury wore kimono on and off stage to sort of challenge notions of gender, I think. And Madonna wore this wonderful scarlet Jean Paul Gaultier ensemble for her music video, Nothing Really Matters. And then you have this, incredible image of Bjork from the cover of her 1997 album Homogenic, in which she collaborated with Alexander McQueen, the photographer Nick Knight, and the stylist Katie England. And this resulting image combined cultural references. The dress is a sort of kimono-style dress by McQueen. Her hairstyles were inspired apparently by Native American tribes, but I always think of them as a bit like Edo period courtesans. And she sort of drew really from non-Western ideals of power and beauty to refashion herself as a sort of futuristic warrior goddess.
Power, you mentioned that word, which as a former anthropologist rings lots of bells for me, because it would seem that it's not unproblematic, however, this wearing of kimono or wearing of a kimono-inspired garments. Would you say this is cultural appropriation? This is where our first conversation started, actually.
Yeah. Obviously, it's a complex and sensitive issue. We have thought about it quite a lot for the exhibition and the accompanying book. But can you say that any non-Japanese person wearing a kimono or a kimono-inspired piece of fashion or a kimono jacket that they've bought from Primark. Is that really cultural appropriation? Again, as in the 19th century, it's not very clear cut. Such claims, I think, are often based on the notion that kimono have very specific national and traditional significance, and that as such, they should remain unsullied, untouched. And the danger of such criticism is that it can fall into the trap of accepting a very reductive and orientalizing image of the kimono, which actually reinforces the stereotype of Asian clothing as unchanging costume. And this really denies the kimono its own dynamic sartorial history, the history that we explore in the exhibition, and the kimono's part in a sort of ongoing, complex and vibrant international fashion network. And it's important to notice that Japan has always had agency. If you're talking about power and who holds power, Japan has always had agency, and certainly does now, in the sharing and the promotion of Japanese culture, including kimono culture. And as we've seen with the story so far, that there's quite a layered complexity in the way that fashion historically has been translated across cultural boundaries. That's essentially often how fashion works. And certainly since the 1950s, many designers, including designers in Japan, have continued to absorb the tenets of kimono and the potential for the garment to be deconstructed, reformed, translated, transformed, makes it a uniquely versatile foil for fashion. So what we have on the screen here is a wonderful Kabuki Dress by Rudy Genrich. So in that check that was so very popular in the Edo period, and this wonderful sort of obi-like sash, this sort of series of mini dresses he did in the 60s. In the middle is Rei Kawakubo for Comme des Garçons. Obviously, you don't associate her work as referencing her own cultural heritage, if you like. But in many ways, it does, in the way that she sort of constructs and deconstructs fabric on the body. For this one, this is a slightly different kind of gown, but the skirt of the gown is painted by a kimono painter, and this padded hem reminds one of outer kimono, of uchikake. And then the Sydney-based fashion designer Akira Kurosawa, he grew up in Kyoto, but is very much celebrated in his adopted homeland for sort of creating designs that merge kimono with a sort of relaxed Australian attitude.
So looking at these kimono-inspired fashions outside Japan, what is happening in Japan itself? You mentioned before, we saw the coming of age ceremony, the wedding picture, these very formalized, codified wearing of kimono. Is the kimono disappearing in Japan, or?
Well, I think up to relatively recently, the future for kimono looked particularly bleak. But what's happening now is there's a real kimono revival in Japan, and that's a sort of renaissance, if you like. And that's one reason why we thought it was an appropriate moment to do an exhibition on kimono. This really started on the street. There's a wonderful photograph that you can see here from 2010, with a restyling of vintage garments by young Japanese, perhaps people who didn't have the associations that their parents or grandparents would have for what kimono meant. And also that there was it is a sort of reaction against the ubiquity of clothing, that all shops everywhere in the world sell the same fast fashion. And this has really inspired a new generation of a new wave of kimono designers in Japan that approached the garment in a sort of very fresh kind of way. So Rumi Shibasaki is seen very much as the pioneer of this, and her brand Rumi Rock often has quite a gothic edge. But for the exhibition, we chose Edo period hairstyles as the design for the kimono. And her tiny studio is in Yoshiwara. She's very proud of the fact that it's in what was the former pleasure district of Tokyo. And I'm wearing Rumi Rock today. I don't know if you can see, how clearly you can see that I am wearing a kimono by Rumi, which has got bats on. I don't know if you can see. Oops. Oh, here we are on the top. So quite a sort of gothy kind of thing. And then in the middle here, you've got modern antenna, very much inspired by graphic design, British rock music, hence the Union Jack. And this one is actually digitally printed polyester, so much cheaper than a formal kimono. But it's important to remember that kimono are still very beautifully made. we're not talking about throwaway fashion here. These are kind of garments that you keep and you can restyle them. And talking about stylish, this is something you see here with Yoshi Kimono. The kimono that are being worn in this image on the catwalk, they're cut kimono in the standard way, in the standard shape, but sort of worn in a very different kind of way. And the Yoshi Kimono brand is that of Yoshiki Hayashi, who's an acclaimed musician and composer with the band X Japan. So today's wearers really appreciate kimono, not as a form of tradition, but as a dynamic item of fashion. And going back to your earlier question about cultural appropriation, we did ask all our designers how they would feel about me, say, wearing a kimono of theirs in Japan or in Britain or anywhere else. And for them, this is not an issue at all, because, of course, what these designers want is for kimono to survive, for them to change and survive and be adapted. They're quite interested in the idea that Westerners might experiment with wearing kimono. And that's something that's exciting for them and fresh, and something that they would certainly encourage.
Oh, wonderful. I see all of these kimono here in front of me are women's kimono, yes? What about men?
Yes, well, actually, Rumi, her kimono are fairly sort of unisex, but there has been quite a revival of men wearing kimono. I've noticed the sort of newer designs from Kimono Revival going back sort of 10, 15 years, but for men, it's been more recent, the last 3 or 4 years, I would say. So Shizukia, that you can see here on the right, they're intent on bringing a bit of samurai swagger back to menswear. Collaborations are also very, very interesting. So the tea kimono range is a collaboration between Norwegian designer and tailor T. Michael. This is him here in the image on the left, and the Japanese company Y & Sons. Their aim is to make kimono a staple of men's wardrobe again. And in the middle, just to mix it up a bit, we've got Tom Brown, obviously a very famous New York designer who always designed suits rather than anything kimono form, but he has utilized in this particular collection kimono imagery, and I was particularly like the idea that the way that it moves across all the elements of the suit in much the way that a kimono does. And T. Michael's clients include women, and as I said, Rumi's creates unisex garments, and many designers are very conscious about doing that now. And in the middle here is Hiroko Takahashi. She's modeling her own design here, but they're kind of unisex. And you've got one behind you there. I've got my Hiroko fan, which I believe you'll be selling in Japan House very soon.
When we open, yes. And in fact, these arrived only very recently as well.
Oh, yes. We're all looking forward to those.
my Takahashi Hiroko mask as well.
Yeah. So in the last section of the show, we combine the garments, regardless of where they come from. So here on the right, displayed alongside Hiroko Takahashi in the show is Duru Olowu, who's a Nigerian-born designer based in London. He's got a very global approach to fashion. He finds a sort of sartorial synergy between kimono and the buba, which is a Yoruba kind of robe. And we also wanted to think about sort of younger generation coming through. So what you see here on the left is Milligan Beaumont, who combines a love of the urban style and skateboarding with this idea that the kimono surface can create a story in much the same way that Edo period designers often used it. And she did a wonderful skateboarding geisha, it was called, collection for her 2015 graduation from Central St. Martin's. So we approached her and she'd sold that entire collection to Christina Aguilera, but she made a new garment, Fuji Heartbreak, especially for us. So really in the exhibition, from the sophisticated culture of 17th century Japan to the creativity of the contemporary catwalk, the kimono has really been subject to both local and global reinvention, while always somehow retaining something of its Japaneseness, which is what I think really gives it this very unique place in the story of fashion. Thank you.
My goodness, thank you, Anna. That timed to perfection. Thank you so much. We do have quite a few people asking questions. One thing, of course, is that you've given us a shot there of the exhibition itself. I mean, sadly, it had to close.
19 days it was open.
Just 19 days.
Very exclusive.
And I know a lot of people have been asking this in our question and answer. is, will they be able to see it again? Will it reopen?
Yes, it was very sad. As you can imagine, we were quite devastated when it closed, and now it's just all sitting there in South Kensington under wraps in the dark. And we made some kimono films, which people can watch, a tour. Much of what I covered today is in the tour of the films on YouTube. And I would recommend, in the interim, buying the book. But yes, I had thought it might die forever, but it will reopen. We're just negotiating with our lenders now to hope that they will allow us to hold on to things a little bit longer. We don't know of exact dates. Obviously, the government have now said that museums can open from July. So I think it's going to be a slow process for us. I think we obviously have to be quite careful. We want to welcome everyone back in their hordes, but also we want them to remain safe and COVID secure, I believe is the expression. So I'm not quite sure of the dates yet, but I think we will hopefully announce them in the next few weeks. And I'm kind of got my fingers crossed that it will be on for much of September and October. So people will have the chance to see it.
Wonderful. I will have to go and visit again, most definitely. That's really good news. Good. I'm very glad. We've got some questions, if you don't mind. Okay. We have a question. People can ask anonymously, or they can put their name. I'll try and say the name when we do know. But this one here is: as you know, there are many types of patterns used for kimono. Do you have any favorite pattern to wear? If yes, why?
Oh, that's very tricky. I wouldn't know that I had a favorite pattern as such, but I suppose the kimono that's right at the very beginning, the one that's got the red stream and the irises, I've always loved. I love irises, and I've always loved that kimono. I saw it first in a book. I even got a pad with it on before I ever saw it in real life. So I think that the idea of the way that it's sort of, the stream sweeps across the whole garment, and it would have moved with the person as they walked along. So I thought, curator's choice. That's why it's the first object in the show.
Ah, I see. Thank you. Curator's choice. The next question: how did you get into curating?
Oh God, that's a very long.
And could you talk a little bit about your career with Japan?
My career, yes. So, well, I sort of, that's why I started sort of being a historian, and then I sort of switched when I got to university to studying art history. But I was, typical Western art history. I sort of know about sort of paintings, Western, European paintings of the, late 18th and 19th century. And then I joined the V&A as a junior curator. And then one day they decided they needed somebody in the East Asian section. So I was put there, and I knew absolutely nothing about East Asia at all. And I was only going to stay there a few months, to help them out with the project they were doing. And I stayed, and that was, many, many, many years ago. So, so I just got interested in Japan. I did a sort of course at SOAS, and I chose kimono just because all of my colleagues, they have a sort of material, they know a lot about ceramics or prints or whatever. So I chose kimono for purely subjective reasons, because I like clothes and textiles and fashion. So that's where it all began, longer ago than I care to remember now. So I suppose you could say, people often say, how long have you been working on this show? And I would say 4 years or a lifetime, depending which way you look at it.
I do like the way that you've come at it as well, because you're able then to give this depth to this cross-cultural side of your study, and which I extraordinarily valuable and immediately accessible as well for us. I think it's something it resonates, isn't it? Thank you. Okay. Oh, what a brilliant presentation! This is from Kerry. Thank you. Please, can you make the recording available? My internet connection was not so good as it kept on freezing. Well, we have this actually recorded on Facebook. So if anybody wants to see it afterwards, they will be able. And
I said, sorry, obviously you want to promote Japan House, but the V&A films are available on YouTube, and they've been nominated for a Time Out Award. So please vote.
Marvelous. And I have seen them, and they are very, very good indeed. There is another question here from Cornelia. Do you think the current situation can affect, and if so, how, the emerging kimono revival?
You mean the COVID-19 situation, or just a general situation? I think it's very sad this happened, because what was nice about this exhibition, what was particularly rewarding for me, was meeting all these new designers. And they all came to the opening, and it was very exciting. And it was this idea that there was a sort of start of something fresh and new, because they didn't necessarily all know each other, or even, a lot of them, Tataro's cited the high-end one. They didn't really talk to him, particularly the independent studios, and they all got to know each other. They wanted to collaborate. So I hope that hasn't, I hope that will carry on, and with this strange sort of period we're in at the moment. And when I asked Rumi how she was doing, she said she was fine, because she'd come to Britain. She stayed quite a long time. It's the first time she'd ever come to the UK, and she just did loads and loads of drawings. So she said she's making loads of designs inspired by her trip to London. So I'm interested to see. They will be very cross-cultural kimono. So I'm interested to see what she comes up with. So
nice. Your exhibition has inspired her as well.
Yes, I hope it's this is. Hope by next year we'll have all recovered safely, and that there was this interest in kimono and the interest in wearing kimono will continue to build.
Thank you. You mentioned your yukata earlier on. Yes, that's what you're wearing, isn't it?
Yes.
Where do yukata fit into kimono culture?
Well, the yukata were originally it was something that you would wear sort of in the bath while you were bathing. But in the Edo period, it was something more worn after the bath. And then it became just a very popular thing to wear in the summer, generally. A very, very informal, casual style of dressing. And in some ways, yukata is the one kind of kimono that's kind of carried on being worn, because people still in Japan in the summer, in festival seasons particularly, would wear a yukata. And it's when I first went to Japan, it was the only time you saw younger people dress up was in the summer in yukata. So it's a very easy style to wear, because you don't have to wear all the undergarments or do it very formally, and it's cooler. Although I have to say it's still very hot. I've tied it very loosely because it was so hot today. But yes. They're always sort of made of cotton and sort of very easy garments to wear.
Exactly, and they're after bath wear, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very, very comfortable. We have another question here, from Bryony Strange, who's asking, was color a symbolic tool with kimono pattern?
Yes.
Were particular colors used for kimono reserved for special events, for example?
Yeah, well, color often has quite a sort of poetic meaning in Japan. Some colors were reserved, sort of the purple color was reserved really sort of for the imperial household. And the color red is probably the one the color that people talk about a lot. Benny red, it comes from the safflower, and it creates a sort of a sort of scarlety, almost sometimes to orange kind of red, and that was a very popular color. But it's a color very much associated with love and passion and romance. It's seen as a color for the young. You wouldn't wear it if you were an older woman. It would be seen to be a bit inappropriate for an older woman. And Benny red itself, the color fades very quickly. It's quite a fugitive dye, so we have to be very careful with the red kimono we put on display. And it was that idea that it somehow symbolized mad, passionate love that's drives you crazy, and then it's all over in about a month. So it had that kind of symbolism that was somehow related to the actual properties of Benny red. But it was a very, very expensive dye. And often it was used with a small scale shibori, the tie dyeing technique, which was also very expensive. So every now and again, the government, worrying that all these merchant classes on the bottom were getting out of step with their clothing and wearing things that were above their station, would clamp down with sumptuary laws. And Benny red was one of the things that was often forbidden. Not everybody obeyed the laws for very long. Often there's the 3-day rules, but they did usher in different changes, and it sort of drove Benny red underground, if you like, because there's no rules about your lining or your undergarments. So red became a very popular color for the lining of kimono and for under kimono, and somehow you'd wear a very plain, perhaps a sort of blue or just simply striped garment on top, and you'd have something very flamboyant and red underneath, and that would be seen at the collar or at the hem as you walked along, and that was seen as much more seductive. than actually wearing an overt red kimono. So colours are quite interesting to sort of study, and certainly kimono dyers would sort of secretly guard their dye recipes, and often they would work with kabuki actors, for example. Kabuki actors would want a particular kind of colour for a particular part, and they'd work with the dye houses, and then that would popularise the colour. So it would help both the actor and the dye house.
We had an exhibition, of course, at Japan House of the Yoka dyeing workshop colours. Benihana, the safflower, was very prominent in that, of course.
Very hard to dye with Benny Red, yeah.
And expensive.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question here from Sarah Kilkenny, who's asking, when I think of kimono, I imagine they're always made of silk. However, I read that Japanese kimono makers have used banana fiber for hundreds of years. Can you please talk a little about fabrication?
Yeah, different fibers. The most of the kimono in our show are silk on the whole, because they're the very high end haute couture. But other kinds of fibers are used. Cotton, of course, everyday kimono, most people would wear cotton. Cotton isn't indigenous to Japan. It was first introduced in the 16th century, and then from the 18th became a much wider used kind of fabric. But indigenous plants like hemp and rami, and even the wisteria plant, fibers would be extracted from these plants and twisted. They were very difficult to work because you couldn't spin them in the way that you can silk. So you'd have to twist the fibers together. And the rougher kind of fibers would be used for perhaps more, sort of rural classes, lower class people who weren't very particularly rich would wear perhaps just, hemp or so on. But very, very high quality hemp and rami was still quite expensive. And summer garments are quite often made of rami or of hemp. The banana fiber is basho is only used really in Okinawa, so in the archipelago of islands to the southwest of Japan, and it's the tree banana plant. It looks quite different from what we think of as a palm tree with bananas, and that was a particular kind of cloth that was woven and used there. And again, it was sort of something that might be dying out, but there's quite a revival now in using banana fiber again. And in the north, in Hokkaido, using of elm bark fiber, for example,
for making atush, yes, the Ainu. Thank you. We have a time for probably a couple more questions, just a couple more. So we have a question from Laura. Were there any kimono that you wanted to exhibit but were unable to secure for the exhibition? It's a nice question. What secret?
There are a few, mainly because some of the very early ones from Japan, but when we went to see them, they were really too fragile to show, to travel them. So those we had to give up on a little bit. But on the whole, I have to say people were very generous in their loans. But as some of you may know, there is a kimono. There's a kimono. This is the moment for kimono, I think. And there's a kimono exhibition at Tokyo National Museum that was supposed to open in April, but is now opening next week on the 30th of June. So sometimes when I wrote to potential lenders, they went, "Oh, Anna, I'm sorry, that garment is already committed." I thought, so, but luckily enough, the curator of that exhibition, Dr. Oyama, is a good friend of mine. We've known each other for many years. So when I went to her, she very kindly actually gave up some of the choices that she had made in order that I could borrow them. It was extraordinarily kind of her, including the man's kimono with the hawks on, which I particularly wanted. And then when ones I'd chosen from her collection that she wanted to use, she found alternatives for me, either in her collection or in other collections and so on. So when you do an exhibition, you always have to know that, you are going to get some loan requests refused. But in the end, it always comes together. And until you ask a question like that, you don't know that anything's missing, of course.
Indeed.
And there were other things sometimes, even when for space reasons, we'd had originally included a few more paintings showing women in kimono in the 19th century. And then we just didn't have the space in the gallery to show them. So we weren't able to borrow those and things like that. But on the whole, people have been incredibly nice. And the first loan we negotiated was from Lucasfilms for Obi-Wan Kenobi. and they lent it even though they had a moratorium. And then there were other things like the Madonna outfit, which we borrow from Madonna, so that it is one of those moments where you get an email that says, "We have spoken to Madonna," and she says yes. So that's very nice emails that you like to open.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. We have some hello from Miami, who asking, maybe this is just our last question. Would love you to tell us anything related to the denim influence in Japan.
Oh, yes.
The use of it in kimono, like the ones in the town of Okayama.
I mean, denim as a sort of a cloth for kimono has become incredibly popular in the last few years, both for men and for women. And quite a few of our kimono makers also make denim kimono. And there's one, I'm not sure you can see it. You might be able to see it on the screen here. There's one company called Fujikia, who was a designer that started off cutting men's suits. So he makes kimono out of men's suiting fabric, so like pinstriped, which you wear with a shirt and a tie.
Yes.
But he also makes, and those are more expensive, but he also makes denim kimono. And he actually includes all those sort of different weights and different kinds of stitching and different kind of edging for all those sort of denim aficionados, just like there are jeans aficionados for the garments. But right up to the high end. So Jotaro Saito, who we saw right at the beginning, he makes denim kimono. When you meet him, he's usually wearing a denim kimono. And in fact, one of the kimono I have, obviously, as I went along, I did acquire some for myself. It was irresistible. I did buy a denim kimono, and I like to wear that one because it's very soft and very comfortable to wear. But I wore this one today because it's cooler. So.
Yeah, and I'm nice and cool in Japan House. I'm sorry that you're so warm.
I've swapped my glass of water over because I've drunk so much water. Here we go.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. We have one last comment I just want to share with you, actually, that we found here from Demetrius. Most delightful and informative get-together, V&A and Japan House. What else could you ask for? Two of our arts and culture hubs in London. Looking forward to the reopening.
Good. Well, hopefully, they should announce it in a few weeks' time, I hope. Good. I mean, I'm hoping they're going to tell me in a few weeks' time and then announce it.
Good, good. Thank you. Sadly, that's all we've got time for today. Anna, thank you so much. I've been waiting for this for a long time. It's fantastic. Please do, everybody, go to the V&A once it reopens so that you can see the exhibition. Please do. It is very, very beautiful. We at Japan House will be having some more online events coming up soon. We have an online gallery tour of our virtual exhibition, Anno's Journey, focusing on Anno's picture books. We had an exhibition inside Japan House, and we created a 3D tour of the exhibition. And the panel will include manga artist Kubo Kiriko and designer Tomoko Azumi. And we'll also have BSL, British Sign Language Interpretation, as well for participants in the Zoom webinar. That's on Thursday, the 9th of July. And then our manga workshops have proven extraordinarily popular. And we are continuing this with a series of masterclasses with the very, very talented and extremely important manga artist, Kubo Kiriko. They will be on the 15th and the 29th of July and the 12th of August. She will also be drawing with pen and ink as well. And so we'll having a different way, a look at the way that you think manga would be drawn. Our last classes were all digital. And you just mentioned that you'll be opening in a few weeks' time. Hopefully, there'll be an announcement to say that you'll be opening in a few weeks' time. To everybody listening today, exclusively, I'm the first one to say this, that Japan House will reopen. The ground floor of Japan House will reopen on the 4th of July, exclusively for newsletter subscribers and corporate members for the first 5 days. An email will be sent to subscribers and members tomorrow, which will include a link for booking a visit. If you haven't already, you can still sign up, if you do, by the end of today, and you will be able to get this email in order to be able to be one of the first to come back to Japan House. A timed entry system will be in place, so visits must be booked in advance. The ground floor will reopen to the general public from the 9th of July. Again, all visits will require advance booking, and the link for the general public will be available from the 1st. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. A feedback form will be sent to you. Please do help us by filling that in. It does, in fact, help us do more. It only leaves me to say thank you once again, Anna. Marvelous.
Pleasure.
Totally, totally, totally absorbing. Thank you very much. I look forward to being able to visit when you reopen. Thank you very much indeed.
And I'll come to Japan House in the interim, I hope.
Please do come and see our Hiroko installation here, and come and get a face mask. Thank you very much indeed. Take care, stay safe still, and bye-bye, and see you soon, I hope. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.